Our next presenter is Matt Dollinger. Matt is a double major in environmental studies and political science. He's currently pursuing honors and looks forward to attending law school in the future. Matt loves fish and fishing. He's an avid fly fisherman. And as you will soon see, that passion led him to his Capstone project, which he found himself. The title of his presentation is Early Fish Gets the Worm, Examining Differences in Spawning Timing Between Male and Female Hatchery and Wild Chum Salmon. His host organization was Sitka Sound Science Center. His site supervisor there was Alex McCarroll of Sitka Sound Science. His faculty advisor here on campus and in this building, in fact, was Professor Thomas Quinn of the School of Aquatic and Fishery Sciences. Without further ado, I'd like to turn the floor over to Matt.
Whoops. Can you guys hear me? Sweet. Let's get started. Salmon in the Pacific Northwest are a staple of our culture, economy, and diet and have been for centuries. It's no surprise then that over the recent years, fish hatcheries have begun releasing farm-raised salmon into our wild streams to help account for decreases we've seen in wild stock. So what are fish hatcheries? Fish hatcheries are essentially fish farms in which salmon are spawned and raised in cramped pens until they eventually reach adulthood. Once they reach adulthood, these salmon are either sold commercially for food or, like we've mentioned, released back into wild streams. So I want you guys to all do me a favor right now and close your eyes. I want you to imagine what a good-looking, healthy salmon looks like to you. You know, we're all in Washington. We can probably all imagine what a salmon looks like, right? Maybe some sharp teeth, maybe some nice spawning colors. Now I want you guys to open your eyes and tell me if this is what you were thinking of. Probably not, right? But the harsh reality is many farm-raised salmon do end up looking something like this. A mix of disease and inbreeding will leave these fish with poor genetics that, once they're released into the wild, can be passed down to future generations. In the state of Washington, salmon hatcheries have come center stage over recent years and become a very controversial issue. Many environmental organizations have called for an end to hatchery release programs, citing the importance of keeping our rivers wild, especially in the face of rising water temperatures. So this past summer, I worked for the Sitka Sound Science Center in Southeast Alaska as a fishery technician. We worked in partnership with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, collecting DNA samples from both hatchery and wild chum salmon carcasses in various Alaskan streams. So after a few weeks of dissecting pretty smelly chum salmon carcasses all day, I eventually settled on two research questions. What is the discrepancy in spawning timing between male and female chum salmon? And is there a difference in spawning timing between hatchery and wild chum salmon? So while I was in Alaska, I worked in two chum salmon spawning grounds, Sawmill Creek and Prospect Creek. These creeks both see returns of up to 1,000 chum salmon each year, and these creeks worked well for my personal research as they see returns of both hatchery and wild fish. So my methods involved first an extensive literature review. In this literature review, I looked over previously published scholarly work that discussed the potential implications of hatchery and wild salmon interactions and the possible consequences of the continuation of this. My next method of research involved field sampling, the whole of my on-site field sampling, which allowed me to observe up close the general trends in sex-based spawning timing for the 2022 season. And my final method involved an all-encompassing data analysis from 2019 to 2021, which included 3,000 chum salmon carcass samples. With this data, I was able to create frequency distribution histograms that visually depicted general trends in spawning timing for those 3 years based on hatchery status and sex. Here's an example of one of those histograms. Note that the horizontal axis shows us the days into the season, or days from July 22nd, that sampling occurred, while the vertical axis shows us the number of carcasses that were sampled. Note, you'll see hatchery in orange and wild in blue. So the first histograms we're looking at come from Sawmill Creek, and we'll notice that hatchery males on this creek peaked in carcass collection around 15 to 18 days in, while wild males peaked around 18 to 21. Hatchery females peaked around 18 to 21 days in, while wild females peaked around 21 to 24 days in. This timeline tells us the actual calculated median dates of carcass collection for all fish on Sawmill Creek, and it confirms our suspicions. Hatchery males and hatchery females found their median carcass collection date on average 3 days earlier than their wild counterparts. Here are the histograms from Prospect Creek, and they tell us a similar story. Both hatchery males and hatchery females peaked in carcass collection between 21 to 24 days into the season, while their wild counterparts didn't peak until around 27 to 30 days into the season. And once again, our median timeline tells us we were right. Hatchery females and hatchery males beat their wild counterparts by, again, an average of 3 days. So what are the implications of hatchery chum salmon entering these streams before their wild competitors? Well, salmon compete with one another for habitat and space in which they lay their eggs. This means that hatchery chum salmon in Prospect and Sawmill Creek have, on average, a 3-day advantage in timing over their wild competitors. It really comes down to a case of the early fish gets the worm. Salmon can be picky on where they choose to lay their eggs, and the salmon spawning ground is finite. This means that fish that do enter the streams earlier have the first chance to spawn, and thus an inherent advantage. Salmon face a variety of issues ecologically in our world today. Hydroelectric dams, overfishing, and climate change all pose serious issues to these fish, and it's important that we equip them with the best possible genetics for survival going into the future. This may not include hatchery genetics. So I'd like to give a big thank you to Alex McCarl and Chance Gray, my site supervisors, my faculty advisor, Thomas Quinn, all my awesome crew members, Alaska Department of Fish and Game for giving me such great data, friends and family for their support, and of course, salmon across the world. Yeah.
All right, we have a question for Matt. Oh, got a couple hands up. Go ahead.
Couple hands. Yeah.
I'm curious, so the image that you showed of the salmon with the interesting schnoz, was that a farm salmon or a hatchery salmon?
Well, for the sake of my project, it's a pretty similar idea. It's a salmon that came from, yes, a hatchery and was released into the wild. So I suppose pretty much the same thing. I mean, I'm curious the difference that you are looking for.
The difference that I'm coming from is the farm, in my mind, farm salmon is produced for consumption and it is held in a pen for its entire life.
Right.
Whereas a hatchery salmon could come from a hatchery, be released, and I imagine are the ones that are coming
So,
back to the stream.
Right. Hatchery salmon released into the wild, found on a riverbank.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Did you find any other studies similar to yours? And if so, what was their data set size? Was it similar to yours? Bigger?
So, yeah, there's been a lot of studies, none so much in my specific region. It's important to note that my field of study was for chum salmon in Southeast Alaska. Salmon fisheries across the world have different issues that they face. So there are definitely other studies. There are some that say that hatchery fish in certain fisheries don't have that much of an effect, in which case, their continuation is, normal. But I couldn't find any ones for Southeast Alaska for chum salmon. Assuming the ones that do exist, they probably have a bigger sample size than I did. I was only able to look at 3 years worth of data, which in the grand scheme of things probably isn't that much, but yeah. Yep.
During your research, how were you able to tell the difference between hatchery salmon and wild salmon?
Good question. So the only way, at least, different fisheries have different telltale signs for how you can pick apart hatchery salmon versus wild salmon. For Southeast Alaska and for chum salmon specifically, there is only one way, and it's to dissect, get into their brain cavity, take out bones that are near their ear canal, known as otoliths, and then bring them back to a lab. And under a microscope, you can see if those otoliths have thermal markings, and if they do, then that is a telltale sign it's a hatchery fish. So there's no physical way to tell between hatchery and wild fish just without getting into their brain and looking under a microscope.
Yeah, pick their brains. All right,